Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are. Hosted by Desiree Duffy.
Welcome, everybody. It is time once again for the Books That Make You show. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy. And today we're talking about books that make you realize that there really are two different Americas, but maybe we can still heal our union. Now, if you've been listening to this show for a while, you probably realize we dance around politics. I mean, we don't usually tackle it head on, but it's just there. It's permeated the topics that we read in so many different types of books, fiction to nonfiction. It's just at top of mind. The goal of this show is to bring people together. And that's one of the reasons a lot of times we avoid going too deep into politics. We don't want to be divisive. There's plenty of that going on with us adding flames to that, or adding gasoline to that fire. But then along comes a book and an author who aligns with our vision to heal our nation rather than further divide it. Seth David Radwell is the author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. Now, he believes that our democracy is in crisis. Yet, despite the dire pronouncements from pundits on both the left and the right, he knows from research that our political divisions are not unprecedented. Now, Seth looks at our country's history and the ongoing political tensions through the eyes of the Radical Enlightenment versus the Modern Enlightenment and their dynamic interplay with the Counter-Enlightenment movements over the past few centuries. And he's basically saying, hey, we can look at the past and use that to bring our country forward into the future together. Seth, welcome to the show.
It is such a pleasure to be here with you, Desiree. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I hope I explained that okay. I think I'm going to ask you to help unpack that a little bit further, because we have these two different enlightenments. And can you explain what those are and what the differences are between them?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, your overall summary was terrific. One of the ways I frame it for listeners is that we hear all the time about two Americas, and that we're caught in this bubble, this partisan bubble of getting news from just one source. When I went back and looked at the divisions in America, I think the problem is also another bubble, what I call a time bubble. That we assume that we're so divided today, it's unique, it's crazy. It's not, in fact. We've been divided like this throughout our history. So breaking out of the time bubble, to me, is part of the solution to move forward, just as you summarized. Now, your question is at the root of the division. It turns out I did a multi-year research project for this book, and at the core of our division today is a division that started during our founding between two schools of the Enlightenment. Many Americans understand that the Enlightenment had something to do with our founding, and it certainly did. But in the 18th century, there was a schism in Enlightenment thinking between what we call the Radical Enlighteners and the Moderates. And they had very strong disagreements. In fact, if you think back to history class in high school, if you think that our founding fathers were monolithic, that's not at all true. The radicals were people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and they fought bitterly with the moderates like such as Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. So what were the differences? Well, both schools of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment, just to refresh our listeners, if they're not that familiar with what the Enlightenment was, it was a period of thinking and of time where thinkers really created what we call today modern society. They embraced empirical observation, reason, science, and certainly all of our founders were children of the Enlightenment. But the radical school versus the moderate school had two key differences. One is the radicals believed that a representative democracy, a government of the people, was the only valid form of a social contract. And the second thing that the radicals believed was that, having observed over the centuries prior to the Enlightenment that there was a collusion between the monarchy, the king, and the church to keep people in power, they recognized the importance of a separation of church and state. And so those are, they sound simple, but between in the details of those two things is a huge chasm. So, for example, the moderates believed that the elite, the aristocracy, should really rule the social contract. People like themselves, people who were enlightened. John Adams was a very enlightened, educated man, as was Alexander Hamilton. Many of the moderates were from aristocratic families, so it was kind of the new aristocracy in the colonies. And the moderates believed that they should rule, and they also sanctioned the role of the church in governing affairs. So in simple terms, those were the differences. But what the book does is it traces how those two schools, how those divisions vying for prominence, how it played out. As an example, one of the first parts of American Schism goes through how the Declaration of Independence was a very radical document. All men are created equal. Well, that's 1776. So just a little bit later, 12 years later, by 1787, we have a constitution that gives the right to vote to white men with property, which is a much more moderate view. So how did we get from this radical vision of America to a much more moderate view just 13 years or 10 to 13 years later? How did that exactly happen? And the point of the book is to look at these, I call them pendulum swings, between this moderate and radical school and how it's evolved over time by looking at 6 discrete episodes of American history up until today. So that was a long-winded way of explaining the moderate versus radical.
Well, and it's fascinating too, because we kind of look back at these documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, as being just like the word. Like, we cite them, we reference them, we don't go against them. But the Declaration of Independence was actually more radical and the Constitution more moderate. Is that accurate?
That's completely accurate. And more importantly, the Declaration was a kind of a credo, a reason for being as a country, a reason to come together and declare independence. The Constitution was, in essence, a blueprint for how to govern that country. And one of the and it was much more moderate, and partially, as the book explains, it was more moderate because there were practical solutions that had to get solved. You know, it's one thing to declare independence from Britain. It's quite another to create a governing framework for 13 warring colonies that don't get along and don't see eye to eye. And that's what the Constitution had to do. But you made a very important point, that we take it at its word. The framers of the Constitution recognized how difficult these compromises were. And as a consequence of that, they made the Constitution malleable. It was supposed to be amended regularly as the time is required. And as the book also discusses in a later chapter, there was a revisionist movement that interpreted the Constitution as fixed, set in stone. In fact, there's a famous painting in the later end of the century of it's an image of God handing down the Constitution to Washington, as if God handed the tablets to Moses, as if it was some holy word. It was recast in a revisionist religious tone. And that's, in a way, that's unfortunate, because the Constitution was not supposed to be tablets set in stone. It was supposed to be frequently amended as needed. And that's what the framers wanted. So that in and of itself is an interesting example of how we went from this radical idea of all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How we went from that to the Constitution, which counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person.
Right, exactly. It's interesting too. It seems like we want to always pull religion back into things. We always want to pull the monarch or the the God figure, the father figure, the somebody who's going to watch over me figure. Let's just put it that way. But yet at the same time, it's such an ingrained part of the founding of our country that we have the separation of church and state. But then you see that again and again. You know, you just gave the example of George Washington with the Constitution. It feels like religion is just always pecking away, and that there's factions that are trying to bring that back. And I feel we still have that today. And that's really what the point of your book is that this has always been, we've always done it this way. And yes, this is nothing new. So to that, then I would ask, what do we do?
Well, there is a couple. It's true that we've always had these divisions, and you're right. There's always been this balance between kind of this rational Enlightenment view and this more faith-based Counter-Enlightenment, and that's very much at play today. But I think what's important to remember is that probably the most non-religious part of our country's history, in fact, was the founding era. Because of the way the radicals recognized, they believed faith was very private. Actually, all of the founders did. But Jefferson famously said, you know, we should have freedom of religion in this new country, but we should also have freedom from religion. And the feeling was that they had documented how religion had been used for oppressive purposes for centuries. And as a consequence, even though many of the radicals were pious people and believed, they kept their faith private. Even the moderates. Washington was was more of a moderate, but he was very private about his religious beliefs, and was a Freemason as well as an Anglican. And Benjamin Franklin was a Quaker, but they were very private about their beliefs. Now, to answer your question, so over the course of history, this Counter-Enlightenment wave keeps pushing back. It has. But we've often reinserted the importance of empirical observation and reason, which are our Enlightenment inheritances. Now, so that's what brings us today into your question of what do we do? Because one of the reasons I say in the book that democracy is in crisis is because I feel that our country has always benefited from diverse points of view. In fact, a strong discourse, debate, has been fundamental to our success when it's followed by compromise and reason. In today's debate, I believe that reason and compromise and even rationality itself has been crowded out by rage and anger and acrimony that has replaced and crowded out all truth. That is a recipe for disaster, because a democracy requires the observation and the acceptance of objective truths in the world. And today it seems that truth doesn't matter anymore. In fact, I would argue that when you listen to the debate, it feels as if many Americans have rejected or abandoned the pursuit of truth. They have their own truth. It's kind of what I call in the book this postmodernism, this late postmodernism, that everyone can have their own truth. Well, that's not true, and I can talk to that in more detail. But to answer your question directly, what do? We have to reject this current method of dialogue and talking to each other. What I call it, as human beings, over millennia we've evolved, and we have these amygdala primitive responses of being associated with in-groups and feeling good endorphins when we attack out-groups. It's why it's so much fun to watch a sports game. If you've ever been in a sports arena, you know what I'm talking about. And that type of dialogue and reaction is human. It's part of our primitive being. It's fine for a sports arena, but it's no way to conduct public policy. And what we're trying to do is have serious debates about real issues using, that sports metaphor. That's what we have to reject. Whenever I am talking to students or people, I explain that I love different points of view and I respect your point of view, but we have to embrace truth, observation, what I call the constitution of knowledge. If we reject that, not only do we risk our democracy, we risk modern society. And if I could share with your listeners one analogy, sometimes it seems that when you watch the news, everything is going wrong. Between COVID and attacks on the White House, and we have all these terrible problems. Let's take, as again, American Schism, the book tries to do, let's take a slightly longer viewpoint. Let's say 250 years. 250 years ago, human life expectancy was 31 years. Today, it's over 70. 250 years ago, 1 in 5 children didn't survive till age 5. Today, almost all do. 250 years ago, 4/5 of the world lived in extreme poverty. And today, it's 1/5 of the world lives in that same level of poverty. Point being, in the last 250 years, we've experienced more prosperity, more human flourishing than in the prior 2000. And that is attributable to our Enlightenment inheritance and our embrace of science and truth. It has been a wonderful thing for all humanity over the longer arc. Are we ready to throw that away? Do we want to reject truth and science because it's the latest fad and as if there's no consequence? That is what has motivated me to leave what was a very successful business career, take a 3-year hiatus to write American Schism.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, we've got to establish a new, what I call, it's fight unreason with reason. I'm trying to start a bottom-up movement that rejects the mudslinging of Twitter and the social media expression of rage and acrimony and rancor, by realizing that we can have different points of view and we can discuss them respectfully as long as we're grounded in reality.
Yeah, I love the analogies that you're using and comparing it to sporting events. I recently heard the WWF, professional wrestling, as being an analogy.
Yes.
Even people in politics are saying, you know what, these guys remind me of WWF fighters, because you talk to them when the camera's off and when they're just hanging out, and they're regular folks, but you turn the cameras on or give them Twitter to bang around on, and they put on this show. It's
become entertainment. It's become a stage. You're absolutely right. And but here's the thing, Desiree, it's become a stage show and feels entertaining and fun. But let's just think for a second. Right now, there's a promulgation of the notion that people don't need to get vaccinated, and people are dying because of it. And it's a miracle of Enlightenment science that we found effective vaccines within a year or so of this pandemic hitting. It's kind of amazing. It affirms my point before about the importance of science as being fundamental for human prosperity. And yet, caught up in this entertainment mudslinging is this notion of conspiracy theories that the vaccine is a nefarious plot for the government to control us. I mean, this is the kind of stuff. And by the way, many in the media, and I won't name names, are because it's entertaining and because the base likes this argument, has been promulgating this point of view, which has been very harmful for Americans and causing many deaths.
And I recently had Michael Shermer on the show. He is the president of the Skeptic Society, founder of Skeptic Magazine, an author, a professor himself. And there's this whole idea that his book is called Giving the Devil His Due, because we have to accept these other ideas. We have to let all ideas come out. Not that we can't, negate them or argue against them and debate them. That's part of the discourse. But it seems that nowadays, with social media and the ability to get these messages out there, and the media in general, I mean, let's face it, George Washington did not have Twitter. Our founding fathers didn't have this movement. Like, everything is just moving so fast, and that disinformation is spreading so fast. And what it boils down to is Aunt Mary on the couch seeing two sides. She sees this false equivalency, right? And people will say, well, this news outlet is just as bad as this news outlet. This side is just as bad as this side. And I like to say, wait a second. And this goes back to your point. Truth matters. Just because one side is spewing lies, it doesn't mean their lies have the same weight as the side that has the truth.
Correct. It's as I often say and describe in the book as well, we have an amazing constitution of knowledge. But we build it by, to your point, allowing ideas to be put into this funnel. Anything could be thrown in. It's democratic that way. But it's a funnel because it has to survive testing and verification. As I sometimes say, in God we trust. Everyone else has to bring data. So you need to bring data for your argument. Not everything is true, and that's how our constitution of knowledge works. Stuff that's not true gets widowed out. So to your point, if there are two broadcasts and one has data that's been verified and the other is not based on data, we have a problem. And I'm happy for other points of view to be, raised and discussed. But I ask the people who are discussing them, who are promulgating these ideas, to please bring facts. Because if we spend all of our time disputing what the facts are, we can't get to disputing what's important, which is our interpretation of the facts. Those are two different things. So again, it's why at the root of this book and why I wrote American Schism and embarked upon this 2.5-year journey is because I think we cannot abandon objective truth. And as disheartening as it was over the past few years to see our political discourse devolve to such a low level, it was even more disheartening and troublesome to watch truth go away. And we can't let that happen. We have to fight. That's the mission of Fight Unreason with Reason, and why I'm hopeful that your readers will take a look at American Schism, which gives a lot of, not only does it give a very good encapsulation of this phenomena over our history, the third part of the book talks about a way to move forward that can help us heal, which you started the show with saying, I believe that, and my research shows that 77% of Americans are part of what I call a frustrated majority, meaning they actually are tired of the screaming on the left and right, and they believe that we have more in common than not. But you don't hear them so much because we have a problem with our media model, which seems to incentivize shouting and this entertainment that you referred to. But the frustrated majority, that 70% in the middle, could be center left, center right, they agree on a lot more than they disagree on. They all want their kids to succeed, to get educated. They want freedoms and liberties. They usually believe in equality. So the last part of the book focuses on those common agreements and poses some core questions regarding how we can move the debate forward.
And now you bring up a really good subject too, is education. And there's a lot of discourse right now about what we're supposed to be teaching. And sometimes I get a little bit of annoyed. This kind of goes right along with everything we're talking about. So I don't feel, let's take climate change for an example. I don't have the conversation with anybody about it being real anymore because it's happening. Talking about if it's real is just backpedaling, and now we're not moving forward. And I feel that there's so many things that are going on, and education is a good example too, because there are people who are literally wanting to change or not teach certain truths, aspects of history, merely because they feel uncomfortable with them.
That's right.
So tell me a little bit your thoughts on education, and every parent and politician really concerned about education? Because sometimes it doesn't seem that way.
Well, I think you that's a fair point, and push back to my assertion that everyone wants their kids to be educated. Education is at the root of so much of this. So in the Enlightenment, the Radical Enlightenment, specifically the French Enlightenment, the radicals understood that an educated populace was required for democracy. They knew democracy was hard, but they believed that people could be educated to participate, to have a representative democracy of the people. Now, the moderates, in some ways, sold the people short because they didn't believe that everyone could be educated. And they said, let's rely on the elites to govern. So this notion that you're bringing up of education is fundamental. Now, I think education has to be grounded in reality. And in social sciences, there's an actual history that has been written. Of course, there are different perspectives, and those need to be shared. But denying things like climate change, or not teaching evolution, or other aspects of science, or about vaccines and viruses, these are, I think this is crazy. We have to embrace truth. Now, the one issue that's come up a lot is the interpretation of American history. And here we get into what I call, label mania. People start throwing around these terms, critical race theory. Stop critical race theory from being taught. Critical race theory is a term that's used to discuss a college level major that has to do with revisionist view of our history. And it's based on some true perspectives. I mean, what happened to Native Americans and African Americans through the course of our history is a tragedy, and it should be taught. Now, I don't call that critical race theory, because when the right uses critical race theory as a weapon, they're pointing to this caricature of the left, and certain people on the left certainly believe this, that everybody who's white is a racist, and these are where the extremes get caught out of whack. So I hate terms like critical race theory, because that may be some obscure field of study. My point is that kids in school in K through 12 need to be taught the reality of our history, and I believe this is where that the actual reality, as nuanced as it can be, makes us stronger, not weaker. The fact that we committed terrible sins of the past, as many societies have, including slavery or whatever else, recognizing that and understanding it will allow us to grow together. So, I believe that embracing truth is always better than avoiding it or twisting it. And that's part of, again, the Enlightenment inheritance that we all have. So I would argue that's why the book is about the Enlightenment. And folks who advocate for not teaching truth or bending, or hiding realities are in fact purporting counter-enlightenment ideas, which again are not new. They've happened through our history, but they can often be very dangerous.
Bingo. I agree with you. How about, we're running up against the clock, but I have one more question I want to throw out there about the Electoral College. Yes. What do you think? Should we abolish it? Should we get rid of it? Is it good, bad?
The so remember when I said at the beginning of the show that the framers of the Constitution intended for it to be malleable? Mm-hmm. It has been many times. In fact, originally the president was elected by the senators, was not elected at all there was no popular suffrage in that sense. And senators were elected by the state parties. So the original system was very different. The short answer to your question is the Electoral College is a vestige of an old era. It has to go. It was a compromise that allowed colonies as states to have autonomy, which is very important. The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states. But the fact that, today, in the Electoral College and as senators, which is related, California, let's take California versus the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, which are wonderful places. I've personally never been there, but I have a friend who lives in South Dakota, and I'm planning to visit. My point being is that the economy of California is 40 times that of the Dakotas put together, and the population is 38 times that. So it's not like double, it's 38 times. Yet the Dakotas have 4 senators and California has 2, and likewise with the college. So that's clearly so undemocratic. Now, originally the system was set up for certain reasons, which can be guaranteed in other methods. But the book talks about structural changes in the end, and electing presidents by popular vote, changing the Electoral College, changing how the Senate works. Those are all part of what needs to happen. And the framers, recognize that changes would need to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes.
Seth? Yes, absolutely. Well, I do hope those changes happen. Can you tell people where they can find more about you, your website, where they can find the book? Hold up the book, please. We'd love to see the cover.
So here's American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. And it's available wherever books are sold, of course, on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and in bookstores. There is a hardcover version, a Kindle version, and there's an audiobook that was just released. Part of what's important to me about this movement is that we have a dialogue that's based in reason. So I'd love listeners, if they're curious, to go to American Schism book. So the title, American Schism, and then just BOK at the end.com, which is the website. And they can email me, they can learn more about the book, or they can ask me questions. I love that, and I think it's really important. I hope your readers will take a look at this book. It's getting incredible reviews, which makes me very proud. So I think it's being well received, and I think it's an important read to break out of this time bubble that we're in that's not allowing us to move anywhere.
I agree. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for your desire to bring the nation together and for enlightening us with American Schism. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, Desiree. Thank you.
You bet. And thank you, everybody, for being with us on the Books That Make You show. You can find out more about us on the website, booksthatmakeyou.com. You can also follow on Facebook and Instagram. And as well, make sure that you ring the bell so that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you're always updated when we have a new show talking to authors about the books that make us all exactly who we are.
The executive producer for Books That Make You is Desiree Duffy. Produced and sound mastered by Phil Giangrande. Engineering by Dave Nabox. Social media and promotion by Bree Sweeter. For more, visit booksthatmakeyou.com.